Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this session on buying green power. This is part of a series of events in collaboration with the regional climate partnerships Resilient South, Resilient East, Adapt West, and Resilient Hills and Coasts to help build community resilience through climate adaptation and mitigation. I'm Stefan Caddy-Retalic, the regional coordinator of Resilient South, and I'm really pleased to see such interest in the series. I live and work on the lands of the Kaurna people and want to recognise their continuing custodianship over this country. The Kaurna have lived in harmony with this country for many millennia, and those of us who have more recently arrived in Australia can learn a lot by working with traditional owners, including the Kaurna. This week is NAIDOC Week, which is a particularly important time to celebrate the history, culture and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And this year, NAIDOC is recognising our elders as the cultural knowledge holders, trailblazers, nurturers, teachers, survivors and leaders of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture in Australia. We, of course, pay respect to all of our elders, past, present and emerging. Just to explain how the presentation will work tonight, the chat function is on the bottom left-hand side of your screen. So you can click the icon to use the chat, and then the Q&A function is on the bottom right. And if you click on that icon, you can type in a question that you have for our presenter, and then they will be tallied up for the end. You can also upvote questions by clicking on the thumbs up icon if you think that someone else has asked a question that you also would like an answer to. At the conclusion of the presentation, I'll work through as many of the questions as I can for our presenter. And as with all of the Renew seminars, we'll be recording the presentation tonight to make it available to those who couldn't be here at this time. So on to buying green power. As you're probably aware, we're very blessed here in South Australia to have a huge amount of renewable energy capacity from solar and wind generation that's been built up over the last several years. And as understanding grows about how the choices that we make can impact on our carbon footprint, there's a lot of interest in the purchasing of renewable energy for household and commercial use. Tonight's webinar explores buying green power, the government accredited renewable energy product offered by most electricity retailers to households and businesses in Australia. We're very fortunate to have Dean Lombard as our guest expert this evening. Dean's a former social worker and an energy specialist from Renew who's worked on issues such as energy efficiency, fuel choice, consumer protections, hardship assistance, and community energy projects. He's interested in helping people and communities take control of their energy needs and make the system work for them. I will now hand over to Dean.
Thanks a lot, Stefan, and hi, everybody. Nice to be here. I'm coming to you from the land of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people in Western Melbourne. And yeah, as Stefan said, South Australia is blessed with lots of renewable energy, more than most places in Australia. I was looking at the data just before, over the last 12 months, 70% of the energy used in South Australia was renewable. That's heaps more than any other state, except for Tasmania, that's got so much hydro. And even though on a cold winter week like this one, you might find a lot less. Typically, it's and over summer, you find a lot more. Like last summer, just gone, SA used about 80% renewable. So that's always good to know. But yeah, look, people are often still interested in using as much as possible. So I'll get into my little presentation where I'm going to sort of basically explain what green power is, so that you know and can make your decision about if you want to buy green power or not. So I'll just put my screen up there. And yeah, if you've got any questions, put them in the Q&A. There'll be time at the end to answer them. I'll answer them if I can. If I can't answer a question, which happens sometimes, I will find out the answer of someone who's a bit smarter than me, and I'll send it through so you can find out. So yeah, I'm from Renew. Renew is a community-based organization that works. Its mission is to basically help people live more sustainably in their homes, in their communities, and does a whole lot of stuff around change to be more sustainable, including, you know, informing people about stuff, giving them information about technology and other ways that you can become more sustainable, as well as advocating to governments on policy and with industry as well. And Renew also publishes some magazines and has a really informative website. So if you want to find out more about any of the stuff that Renew does, I really do recommend checking out the website at least. It's some good stuff on there. Right, so basically The best way to reduce your carbon footprint from your energy usage is putting solar panels on your roof. That is hands down the most effective way and actually the cheapest way. But I'm going to interrupt myself just there because this whole concept of a carbon footprint is something I just want to speak about for a second, because often we were trying to take our responsibility for reducing our emissions, but it's just good to remember that it's not actually our fault. It's actually about the way society produces its energy, produces its materials. We can have an impact in our individual lives. And if we want to have an impact and we do it, that's fantastic. But it's just good to remember that it's actually not our fault. So let's do what we can. And it's not all up to us. It's up to us as a whole community to reduce our emissions. On the carbon footprint in particular, I'm just showing this article from The Guardian a year or two ago, where they basically talked about how it was actually this coalition, the PR people who were working for oil companies who first came up with the concept of the carbon footprint, specifically in order to make individuals feel like it was up to them. And yes, we can make a difference. And the metaphor I like to use when thinking about this is to think about waste. Think about, because we're often also conscious of the waste that we produce, like packaging, right, that goes in a bin. When you think about the waste, you can do a lot to reduce your own waste that goes to landfill, but it's very difficult to completely eliminate it because we have to buy stuff and that stuff comes in packaging. And if you ever think about a time when your waste reduced, often it was because a product that you bought changed their packaging so that it was recyclable or less packaging. And that's a good example of how there's a lot that we can do, but in the end, we also have to rely on bigger corporations to change the way that they do things and not leave it all up to us. So yeah, look, I just like to put that out there because, we all got to work together and do what we can, and that's not our fault. But anyway, rooftop solar is the best way to actually reduce your emissions. It's also a great way to save money on your energy bills. If you're able to install solar, it's really worth it. But there are lots of reasons that people can't install solar. And, a few like here, maybe your roof's not right, or you don't have a roof, or you don't own your home. And look, there are some ways around some of these restrictions. Some apartment owners have a roof, and some owners' corporations have worked out how to sort of share solar. And I certainly have spoken to some renters who spoke with their landlord and got them to install solar. There are ways around it, but you can't all do it. So people often look at buying green power when they want to do something and they can't do the solar thing. So they just want to do whatever they can do. And that's really what this presentation is about as well. Here's how you can do this thing, which also helps to bring a little bit more renewable energy into the grid and reduce emissions. So green power basically means you pay a bit extra to basically buy extra renewable energy from the grid in a way that actually supports more renewable energy being added to the generation of the grid as a whole. As I said, it's probably a bit, it's probably more of an issue in states that have dirtier electricity. But even in South Australia, you've got, like I said, an average 70% renewable energy. There's still 30% that's not. That's a lot of gas generation that you have in South Australia. And South Australia also buys coal generation from Victoria. Sorry. So yeah, there's still a lot of room to move. There are a few other things that you can sort of, in theory, do to use more renewable energy. I've listed a couple of things there: neighbourhood batteries and community energy. They're really emerging things that are probably more of a possibility in a few years. And if you have time, I can talk very briefly about those things at the end. But yeah, this is really to focus on green power. So I'm going to try and explain what green power is. Basically, it is a government-backed scheme that's designed to support new investment in renewable energy, renewable electricity, to be specific. And another little tangent that I like to take here is to clarify the difference between a few terms that you hear, because these terms often sound like they're the same thing: 100% renewable, 100% carbon neutral, 100% green power. They're actually a bit different. And before I explain exactly what they are, I'm just going to do a very quick energy market 101. Who's who in the zoo? Who is involved? Because these things all are about who does what. So the two most important companies, corporations, in terms of the type of electricity that we buy, are the generator and the retailer. The generator is like a wind farm, a solar farm, a coal power station, a gas power station, a hydro plant, something that makes electricity. That's a generator. They're private corporations. The retailer is the one that you probably know the name of, like Origin or AGL or Energy Locals or Power Shop, or there's a whole lot of retailers. The retailer actually buys electricity from the generators and sells it to you. And it's not sort of direct, because retailers actually buy the electricity from this pool, this sort of market, and then they sell whatever to their customers whenever they need it. So it's not so direct, but they basically have to buy all the energy that they sell. So it's sort of like the accounting happens at the end and matches everything up. There's also, and this is a bit funny, but there's also gentailers, which is a retailer that also owns a generator. And some of the big retailers like AGL, for example, are gentailers. They own generators and they do the retail. And in our privatized contestable energy market, they buy electricity from themselves and sell it to you. Thank you to the gentailers. So to go back to these terms and how they relate to zero emission energy, 100% renewable means that the generator company only owns renewable generators. And I've used Red Energy as an example there. I'm actually not sure if Red Energy serves South Australia, but Power Shop is another one that only owns renewable. Until the recent change, they only owned renewable energy. There's a few around generators who only own renewable energy. So the generator is not making any money from coal or gas. And some generators like to call themselves 100% renewable and say, oh, if you're buying from us, it's 100% renewable. And some energy retailers only who are gentailers, and Power Shop was an example of this before they got split up about a year or two ago. They owned wind farms and they were also electricity retailer. So they could say, we're 100% renewable. All the energy that we make is renewable. But that doesn't actually mean that, the generator doesn't always sell electricity. So that's what 100% renewable is. And some of them, yeah, like I said, some of the gentailers are 100% renewable. But it still doesn't mean that all your energy usage gets offset. It doesn't mean that all your energy usage, like if you're a customer of one of these 100% renewable retailers who own a generator, it doesn't mean that all your electricity is actually renewable, because they have to buy it from the market, and at certain times they can only buy dirty, fossil fuel energy from the market. So although as a generator they're 100% renewable, as a retailer they might not be. I hope that made sense. And if I didn't explain it, put a question down in the Q&A and we'll dig into it a bit more in that section. The next one is carbon neutral. And look, Power Shop has been a good example of a retailer that says, oh, we're carbon neutral. And that means basically, and again, this is a retailer now, we're not talking about a generator, the 100% carbon neutral retailer buys as much renewable energy as they can. And any that they can't, they buy carbon offsets for everything else. So they can say all the electricity that you use from us did not cause emissions, because if you bought dirty energy, we've offset it with carbon offsets. I'm going to explain carbon offsets in a second, so just hold that thought. And then the third one is 100% green power. And this is what we're talking about today. And 100% green power is when the retailer buys extra renewable energy to match your usage to actually support new investment in renewable electricity. So if, for example, your retailer had to buy some coal or gas electricity to meet your needs at a certain time of day when there wasn't enough renewable energy, if it was green power, they would have to go off later and buy the same amount of fossil fuel energy that you used extra from a renewable energy retailer. That's what makes 100% green power different from 100% carbon neutral. And that's also why green power costs a bit extra. And again, I'm going to explain in a bit more how that whole maths works out with that and how the system works, because it's a little bit complicated. But basically the summary is, if you've got a 100% carbon neutral retailer, then your usage is not causing extra emissions in the system. But if you've got 100% green power, then your usage supports growth in renewable energy equivalent to your usage. So you can see that that's maybe, if you're really interested in helping reduce emissions, that's something a bit better than just going carbon neutral. So that's sort of the distinction. And again, I'll keep going, but if I haven't explained that very well, do put a question down and we'll come back to it and we'll unpack it a bit more in the Q&A. And I really want to emphasize that green power is very different to carbon offsets. This is particularly because you might have seen some stuff in the media recently about carbon offsets not being authentic, and that's a bit of an issue with some carbon offsets. But green power is not carbon offsets. Carbon offsets are basically other projects that reduce emissions or remove carbon from the atmosphere. If someone's buying carbon offsets, like say 100% carbon neutral retailer is buying carbon offsets to offset your usage, that means that they buy the equivalent amount of whatever emissions you used by the electricity that they sold you, whatever emissions that produced, they will go to a carbon offset project and buy carbon offsets to the equivalent amount. And carbon offset projects are things like tree planting projects or agricultural emissions reduction projects. There's a few different types. They can be in Australia, they can be in other places in the world. They're basically unrelated to energy usage, but they're all about reducing offsets elsewhere in the system. Gas capture, there's a soil improvement. There's a whole lot of different types of projects. And carbon offsets are sort of important. Like it's a bit complicated because, as I said, if you've seen some articles in the papers in the last 6 months or so, there's been some issues with some carbon offset projects that have sort of said, maybe they're not really authentic, and they were going to grow the trees anyway, so growing the trees didn't really reduce emissions, that sort of thing. So there is a big question about if carbon offsets are legitimate or not, but some of them are legitimate. And the thing with carbon offsets, if we assume that we can get actual legitimate carbon offsets, they are good actually for cancelling out emissions that we can't avoid, right? If you have to fly, you might pay the airline for carbon offsets. You can't make that airplane fly without emissions, not yet anyway, but you can at least pay for get offsets to cancel out the emissions. Some people buy carbon offsets for driving a petrol car, or for, I've got a friend who is a potter and has a gas kiln, and they buy carbon offsets to offset the emissions from the gas. So they do have a role to play if they're authentic. They do have a role to play in helping to cancel out emissions that we can't avoid, but they're different to green power, which puts more renewable energy into the grid. And green power actually changes the balance between the carbon emitting energy and the zero emissions energy in the system. And that's, to me, that's what makes it useful. If you want to try to help reduce emissions and increase renewable electricity. So yeah, I just want to be clear about that difference. Now, to be green power, it has to meet special criteria, which basically means it's new renewable energy and it wouldn't have been made or sold or used otherwise. And this is important because this is to ensure that it does actually increase the proportion of renewables and not just substitute for what was already there. If you think, and South Australia is a good example of this. South Australia already produces heaps of renewable electricity. So if you're buying green power, you want to know that they're actually doing more, making more renewable energy, and they're not just allocating you some that they already produce, and that means somebody else is just using more fossil fuel. And that's what is a key part of the green power system, is that they have this whole system of accrediting the power to make sure that it actually produces more electricity. And we can, we can make sure that it does, because the energy system, there's like, in the end, there's a finite amount of energy in the system. I mean, obviously it can vary, but like, if we use so many gigawatts or whatever in a year, that's how many we've used. And if you make some extra of that be renewable, then you have to reduce the non-renewable part of it, because you can only use it. You can only create the energy that's used. Electricity has this characteristic where, you can only make it when it's used. So that's sort of how it works, basically. And that price premium, the little extra money that you pay for green power, is what makes sure that that extra generation happens. And the way it sort of works ultimately is that renewable electricity generators, they've got their own business case, and they know how much they can produce and how much they can sell in the market, and they won't be bigger than they think they can sell, because then it's not efficient for them. When they know that they can get green power, they can basically, put in an extra turbine, put in extra row of panels, because they know that they'll sell that extra electricity, even if it's not the cheapest in the market at the time, because there's going to be retailers out there who've sold green power and who have to buy that green power, even if it costs more. That's basically how it works. The analogy I like to use, if you have a voucher, say you've got a $20 voucher at a restaurant, it's not enough to buy a whole meal, maybe, if you're going out with a few people. But, if you've got that voucher, that means you can buy a more expensive meal than you otherwise could, because you've got these extra $20 that you can use on your meal. It's sort of a bit like that for the renewable generators. And green power is measured in units or kilowatt hours. Kilowatt hours are the units that we buy electricity in, and 1 unit of green power is 1 unit of extra renewably generated electricity. So if you use 1 kilowatt hour of green power, they make 1 kilowatt hour extra of renewable electricity. And I'm talking about 100%, because that's, the thing about green power is that you can buy it at different proportions. Most retailers that have green power, they let you go, oh, just 50% green power, or 100% green power, or 80% or 10% or whatever. And basically that means if you're buying 100%, then that's 1 for 1. If you're buying 50%, then for every 2 units of electricity you use, they'll get 1 unit of green power. That's sort of how it works. And, we always sort of go, 100% green power is, the gold standard, because if you really want to make a difference, that's the biggest difference that you can make. All my power usage is green power, but we can't all afford that, because green power does cost a bit more. It usually costs sort of 5 to 8 cents more per kilowatt hour on top of your current rate. There are some cheaper and some more expensive ones. The average tends to be around sort of 5 or 6 cents, but it does vary a bit. We'll look into how you can find it in a little bit. But yeah, if you can't afford to get all your electricity in 100% green power, but you can afford 50% or 20%, that's great. Like we were saying at the beginning, we can't all do everything, but we can do what we can do. So I think the advantage of having the variable proportion basically means that, we all can do whatever we can do. If you can afford a bit, we can get a bit. If we can afford a lot, we can get a lot. Yeah. And like I said, when you search for a green power deal, you'll find out like the extra rate that you pay. And depending on your usage, it might cost you $1 or $2 extra a day, which for some people is fine. And for other people, maybe it's not fine. And that's when you might either rethink or just think, oh, maybe I'll get 20% or 30% or something instead. And the way that you can work out, once you find out how much the green power extra amount is, you can work out how much extra will cost you by looking at your daily usage on your bill and just multiplying that by the 5 cents or whatever that it costs extra. Then you can sort of figure out, oh, okay, this is how much extra I'll be paying if I'm using green power. I do like to use this diagram. It's from PowerShop, and I don't endorse PowerShop particularly compared to any other retailer. I know there's been some controversy around PowerShop in the last year or two because they got bought by Shell, and a lot of people don't like Shell, and they certainly are a big carbon emitter, historically at least. But PowerShop do have this really good diagram, which I think is nice and clear compared to all the other diagrams I've seen, which are way more complicated. So that's why I use this diagram. And this is basically how the green power things work. So if you're using energy in your house, you buy green power from whichever retailer you're with, not necessarily PowerShop, could be anyone. They buy extra what's called renewable energy certificates. It's basically a piece of paper, though it's probably just a virtual piece of paper. They buy certificates equal to your usage. So if you used, 100 kilowatt hours, they buy, and you're 100% green power, they'll buy 100 kilowatt hours worth of renewable energy certificates. And they can only use those certificates to buy accredited green power from the market. That means that extra money that they spend buying that is invested in new renewables, because green power is only accredited for relatively recent generation that have capacity to produce more than the market can sort of support, basically. And the end result of that is that there's actually more renewable energy in the grid, not necessarily more renewable power stations, but they're able to produce more because they can sell it to retailers with renewable energy certificates that have to buy them, even if the price is not the best. And that does, in the end, make renewable energy increase in the system. And it's not instant, it takes time. Like, retailers have like a year to spend their certificates. So it's not like it happens right away, but it does happen. And because energy usage, is a zero-sum game in the end, it has to end up producing more renewable electricity. These are like some of the rules around green power to make sure it's genuine. It factors into the environmental impact of the power stations themselves. 1997 is quite a while ago. Most of them are built much more recently than that. And like I said, they have a number of complicated rules that I don't quite understand that accredits them. And they have a system with the certificates to make sure that it's additional. You may have heard of the renewable energy target. That's another government scheme that is similar to green power in that it also requires retailers to buy a certain amount of renewable energy in their portfolio of energy that they buy, and that has to be used. It's the same accreditation. It has to be used for additional renewable energy. And the trick with green power is that it's a different type of certificate, and you can't use the same certificate for both the renewable energy target and for green power. You have to choose one or the other. So they have to meet the renewable energy target, and they have to meet the green power amount that they've got as well. So that ensures that green power is in addition to the renewable energy target. And the renewable energy target has been a big driver of growing renewable energy in Australia, because it's a minimum requirement for retailers to buy renewable energy. And that gives some certainty to renewable investors. They go, we want to build a wind farm or a solar farm, and we know that the renewable energy targets are this, and that retailers have to buy enough, so we can look at the weather and we can look at the cost and availability of fossil fuel energy in the area that we're building in, but we can also add to that, we know there's this renewable energy target and we'll probably sell this much extra because of that, so we can scale up. And with green power, they go, and we know there's green power, and we look at the data on green power, and something like, I think it's like 10% of people or something, or 5% of people buy it or something like that. So it's like they know there's extra, so they go, we can scale up a bit more because we're also going to sell some green power. And yeah, the effect of that over time is that it increases the market for renewable energy. It's like if you had an ice cream shop and people were required to buy ice cream, even though it was winter, you would get to sell ice cream. That's sort of how it works. Some retailers talk about green power gas, but there's no such thing as green power gas. And they probably don't really use the term green power gas, but it might sound like it, like green gas or whatever. There's no green power gas because you can't actually make zero emission gas. And as we discussed, green power has to actually be zero emission. But some retailers do sell what they call green gas. And that basically involves buying offsets to cancel out the greenhouse emissions of the gas. And I explained about offsets before, and the whole 100% carbon neutral sort of thing. So that's what they do for green gas. So, if you can't avoid using gas, because, gas also creates emissions, then, green gas is a little benefit compared to non-green gas, but it's tricky because the emissions of gas are not actually very well documented and monitored, not nowhere near as much as electricity. So it's a bit harder to be certain how much emissions gas actually produces, and therefore how many offsets you need to buy. But just to be clear, green power gas is not a thing. It can't do the thing of making more renewable, because there's no such thing as renewable gas in our system at the moment. In the future, there might be, because, the gas industry is looking at things like using biofuels or using hydrogen and using renewable electricity to make them so that gas will be zero emission. So in the future, there will be zero emission gas, but it's not really here now. And when it does come, it will probably replace fossil gas altogether, because at some point, the fossil gas, or otherwise called natural gas, will have to be removed as much as possible from our energy system because you can't avoid the emissions. And the gas industry is a bit excited about the idea of maybe, you know, having zero emission gas in homes that use gas. It's probably theoretically possible. It's a bit complicated to do it. You need different appliances and everything. But it's also just cheaper for households to just use electricity and not have electricity plus gas. I know that, you know, some gas is probably less common in South Australia than in places than in Victoria. Victoria's got heaps of gas, but there's a fair bit of gas in South Australia as well. And look, you know, one thing that Renew has done is looked at the cost to households of using electric appliances for all their needs, or using typical gas appliances plus electricity for other things. And it's pretty clear that in most places, it's actually cheaper overall to just use electricity if you've got efficient appliances, partly because when you have gas, as you know, you're paying an extra sort of fixed charge to have gas as well. And look, an all-electric home that uses 100% green power is actually a net zero emission home for its what we call stationary energy electricity used in appliances. If you really want to be a fully zero emissions home, you've got to think about, you know, transport, what runs your car, and then you've got to, you know, you need an electric vehicle powered by renewable electricity to have zero emission transport. And then, you know, what about the embodied emissions of your food and other stuff you buy? You can see how it gets pretty complicated to try and be zero emission on everything. And as I sort of said at the start, a lot of that's to do with just manufacturing and, you know, how businesses operate and how they package things. So it's difficult, but it's possible. And, you know, buying green power electricity is one way that you can reduce your electricity usage. So that's the basic thing about green power. I hope that explained it well enough. Please do, put questions in the Q&A if you've got more questions, and I'll try to answer them at the end of the session. If you've decided that you want to get green power, then the next step is, well, how do you get it? How do you find it? And so I'm just going to run a bit through how you might go about that. And the simplest way, and it's a good thing for everybody to do, is to use these a good energy comparison service to basically find out what energy plans are available, find one with a good price, find one with the features that you need. And we normally mainly recommend the government-backed energy comparator because it's not doesn't do commissions, it's not making a profit. It's a service provided by the government to help people choose, and it's part of governments, and in this case, the federal government, Commonwealth government, it's part of their basic policy about, we want the energy sector to be a competitive privatized sector, but people need the tools to find the good price. So that's his website called Energy Made Easy, which you can search for, and be careful when you search for it, because some other slightly less straightforward energy comparison websites try to sort of use that search term to trick you. So if you search for Energy Made Easy, just make sure it is Energy Made Easy with the Australian government logo and all that. Look, there's one other energy comparison website that Renew recommends as an alternative. And look, we don't normally recommend sort of private ones, but the reason that we also say Whatever, this one called Whatever, is a good one, is because although they do take commissions, they also show all energy plans, or as many energy plans as available. The problem with a lot of the private energy comparison websites is that they don't even often, some of them don't actually tell you the cheapest deal. They have quotas because they've got support from various energy companies, and they have quotas that they fill. So, you know, that they'll give them, you know, the next 20 people will recommend this retailer because we've got to fill our quota to recommend that retailer to get our commission. Whatever doesn't do that. Whatever does take commissions, but it also compares all the available offers and shows cheapest price and lets you choose. So that's one reason why we're comfortable recommending Whatever, because they've got a commitment to doing that and to being transparent. And the other reason I mentioned Whatever in particular in this presentation about green power is because Whatever makes it a bit easier to find 100% green power and to do the price comparison of 100% green power. So that's why we sort of like Whatever. So I'm going to just show you briefly how to navigate both those websites. And I'm not going to do like a live website demonstration because something always goes wrong when that happens. So I've just got some slides that just show the basic features. I mean, some of you might have already used them. They're good even, and not just for GreenPower, even if you're just trying to find a better price, because it's really hard to understand energy prices and to work out what's going to cost you, because, you know, the tariffs are complicated and it depends on your usage and all that sort of stuff. But these sites make it a bit easier. But first, I just want to, like, whenever you're working out energy stuff and, oh, okay, I want to change retailers, how much will it cost me, blah, blah, blah. It's always good to try to understand a bit about your energy usage. And energy bills can be a bit complicated, and a lot of people don't really look at them. They just look at the number that they've got to pay and they go, oh gosh, that's so expensive, and then they pay it or not. But there's good information on your bill that helps you understand your usage and does actually help you work out your costs and do comparisons. And so probably one of them is, I mean, we've got this thing at the top, it always shows you the billing period. This is how long a period this bill is for. It might be 3 months, it might be 1 month. That's useful to know because it helps you understand what portion of your time it's for. There's usually a table on the back that shows the tariff, like the actual rates that the actual cost of the electricity. That's the charges over there. The amount that you used, that's the amount that you use. That's the amount that it cost each unit. That's the total. And they have, like, and this is all here. And I've got these little arrows going to, I mean, it's too small to read probably, but, have a look at your bill. This is where it is. That table is how much you used, how much they cost, how much it costs altogether. Sometimes it gets complicated if you've got what's called a control load, like an off-peak electric hot water system, or if you've got a complicated tariff. But this is all where you can find out what your rate is, and you can sort of use that to compare with others. A more useful part is usually down underneath that. There's this thing that shows your usage over a period of time. That's really useful because it shows you that you use a lot more electricity sometimes a year than others. So when you're looking at a bill, whatever time of year it is, it'll help you go, oh, is this a time of year when I don't use much or when I use a lot? Because if you just take one bill, say it's for 3 months, and then times it by 4, it won't necessarily give you the amount that you normally spend or cost, because it might be a time when you use lots of electricity, or it might be a time when you use a little, and they don't see it's different at different times of year. So that's why that chart is historical usage is really useful to help you understand that. But the other really useful thing is that the average daily usage just says, on this bill, on average, you use this many kilowatt hours each day. That's useful when making comparisons, especially if you're comparing, for the same month. If you've got bills that cover your whole year's usage, that's pretty handy to do more detailed comparison. But like I said, these websites actually do the price comparison for you. So these are good as a general guide. And like I was saying before, if you find out how much extra GreenPower is, you can look at your last bill and go, well, I used 8 kilowatt hours a day, and GreenPower's 6 cents a kilowatt hour. So that would have cost me 50 cents extra for that period, or 48 cents extra for that period of time. That's a little good way to do rough calculation as to how much extra it costs. So that would be, okay, 48 cents per day. That means, if it's 90 days for the bill, I can't do that math in my head, but that's how you can sort of work out the effective cost, the difference of cost that it would have been for you. Just those notes. A year's worth of bill is the best way to do it, and winter or summer are usually highest depending on what you use electricity for. If you've got gas heating, summer's probably your highest electricity usage period, but if you've got electric heating like reverse cycle air conditioners, winter might be the highest. Depends on the climate where you live. You might be in a cold part of the state where you do more heating, or a hot part where you do more cooling. But that's just a bit about, here's how to, when you can get your head around the bill, it really helps to think about this stuff. Now, Energy Made Easy, that's the web address up there. You can type it in directly and go to it, and you know that you get there. This is sort of what it looks like. And basically, you choose electricity or gas or both. You type in your postcode, and you click the button. That's as simple as it goes. And then basically it takes you to a bit more detail where you put, you get your postcode and it asks you how big your household is, and you scroll down and it asks you a bit more. It says, how do we do your energy usage? And there's all these options. And if you've got a smart meter, you can use your smart meter data and it will do the bill calculation based on your actual historical usage. If you've got a PDF bill that you got in an email, you can actually upload it to the website and the website can read the bill and use that information. If you've got a paper bill, it will ask you questions. It will tell you, put in this amount, put in that amount, blah, blah, blah. You can also continue with no bill or meter data. And that's actually handy, if you can't be bothered and you don't mind it being approximate. But it's also handy if you're, say, moving into a new house and you're trying to decide what might be the best electricity company for my new house. And yeah, if you do that, I don't have a bill, then it just asks you a few questions. And there was a whole process when they developed this website to figure out what are the things that most make a difference. So you might be, I'm always surprised when I see the questions, why didn't they ask about this? This seems important. And why is that important? It turns out they looked at lots of people's data and they found out these are the things that most make a difference. And that's how they use to estimate your usage. So basically the way it works is they do an estimate of your usage if you answer the questions, or they use your actual usage if you use your smart meter data, or you uploaded a bill, or you typed in information from your bill. And then they basically show you a bunch of energy retailers and they rank them. I think by default, they rank them from cheapest to more expensive. But there's filters in that you can change the way it sorts and the way it filters. So this is just an example. I just did like a dummy test to see what it looked like, and this is what came up. And if you're particularly looking for a GreenPower plan, you can't really see here because it's a bit small, but I'll just zoom in. Wow, how cool is that? They have a little icon on a plan that has GreenPower. You'll need to click on the plan information to see if that's just a GreenPower plan where the price includes it, or if GreenPower is like an available extra, in which case you'd need to do a manual calculation to work out how much extra would it be. So that's sort of the limitation of Energy Made Easy. It's a little more complicated if you're specifically looking for GreenPower to work it out. But like I said, it's got these filters at the top, and if you click on the refine your search thing, you can actually tick GreenPower and then apply the filter. And then it will only show you energy plans that have GreenPower. And that makes it a lot easier, because then even if it's not including the actual amount that the GreenPower costs, the orders is most likely going to be sort of similar in terms of cheaper to more expensive. And you can still look at the detail and look at the GreenPower proportion and just sort of figure out what you think it might be. So Energy Made Easy does work pretty well for finding, well, it works great for finding any energy plan, especially because you can, if you look at these filters, you can actually decide what's important to you. I don't want exit fees. I want to be able to pay by direct debit, or I don't want to be paid by direct debit. I want to have in person. You can choose all these options and it filters the search. So it actually works really well. So I do recommend people try it, especially if you're thinking about changing a retailer, or if your price has gone up recently, as mine has, and it always makes you go, oh, I really should see if I can find a cheaper one. Because you might have found a cheaper one a few years ago and now it's not the cheaper one because the prices change all the time. Anyway, that's Energy Made Easy. Whatever, I just want to show you whatever just quickly, because like I said, it's another option. And we do find, we've checked it out pretty well and we find it pretty reliable. There's 3 features of whatever that I like particularly, and I think that for my purpose, and if you're particularly interested in the environmental impact of your electricity usage, I think these are good features that whatever has. One is that it lets you limit your search to just 100% GreenPower plans, and then it also factors in the cost of the GreenPower. That makes it easier. It can estimate what your results will be like if you had solar panels or a battery. So if you're thinking about getting solar panels, you can basically put in whatever, what if I had, a 5 kilowatt solar system, then how would it look? And then it factors in, your usage as well as the feed-in tariff. And so that's a good feature if you're also thinking about solar. And the other thing it does is you can actually limit the search to retailers who've got overall better green credentials. Because it's not, green power is one thing, but there's lots of other stuff that energy retailers do or don't do that helps or hinders the movement towards more renewable energy. Some retailers are more active in trying to change policies and the way the market works to help better support renewable energy, and some either don't do anything or actually try to resist it because maybe they're trying to show up their own investments in fossil fuels. So I'll explain that in a second. That's the way that they do that ranking. Here's this little screenshot of like what you can do. This is that feature on whatever where you can go at 100% green power. That's what I want. It'll add it into the cost. Here's where you can basically just play around with what if I added solar panels, how many kilowatts, and or a battery, and an estimate of how much solar I use. And it just gives you a bit of it changes your cost estimate based on that. It's pretty rough, but can give you a bit of an idea that might be enough to make you go, okay, I should check this out more. And then you can choose the retailer green rating from 0 stars to 5 stars, where 5 stars is the best. And the way they do this retailer green rating is they use a thing called the Green Electricity Guide. If you're interested in, supporting, giving money to a retailer who's part of the solution and not part of the problem for renewable energy, I really recommend this website. It's done by Greenpeace, and they get an independent sort of analyst to rank all of Australia's electricity retailers against these 6 criteria. And one of them's providing clean renewable energy. That might be about green power and what they buy in the market, etc., what generators they own, but it also is all of this sort of stuff. How transparent and honest is their marketing? How do they deal with pollution and environmental harm? What do they do in their engagement with governments and the industry in supporting new renewable energy, in halting fossil fuel expansion, in trying to end coal use, and that all the stuff that changes the rules around the energy market and the rules around climate policy. Energy retailers are big stakeholders, and energy generators are big stakeholders in these conversations with governments and industry. And, some of them, like I said, some of them are part of the solution and some of them are not. So the Green Electricity Guide basically ranks them according to all these criteria. And they have a pretty complex way where they weight the criteria differently. And basically you pick your state and they'll give you a list of energy retailers from the most green credentials to the least green credentials. So that's good to know if you're thinking about changing. And like I said, in whatever, you can filter your search by how many stars of, how well rated your electricity retailer is in the Green Electricity Guide. So check out the website, greenelectricityguide.org.au. Very recommended. It's one of those things where we can go, let's support the company that's doing the good thing. And look, for many years, this website was a bit out of date, but it's recently been updated. So that's good to know. I'm pretty much almost done here. I just want to come back to the things I mentioned at the beginning. Other options for using, more renewable energy or for lowering your emissions when you maybe don't have solar, or even if you do have solar and you want to do more. And you've probably heard of neighborhood batteries or community batteries. You might have heard of community energy projects. Neighborhood batteries are basically batteries around the neighborhood, in the street, down at the park, or on a meeting strip or something, that actually soak up extra solar generation during the day and then use it later at night. You probably know that, there's a lot of solar generation during really sunny days, and sometimes it's too much for the grid to deal with, and it has to be basically just dumped, or they, have to turn off. It's happened in South Australia a few times. They've had to turn off people's solar inverters so they can't even export solar because there's too much. Neighborhood batteries is where they can actually use that excess solar that's not needed and store it and use it later. It's the same way that bigger batteries, like you've got the big battery in Hornsdale, for example, in South Australia, that's, that does the same thing. It soaks up extra energy, often renewable, and it's not needed in the middle of the day when there's so much production, and it's used later for, if to help with the peak or to help with stabilizing the grid at other times. So neighborhood batteries are small versions of that around the neighborhood. And there's a few pilot projects happening. we need some changes to the energy regulatory system to make it work more cost effectively for people and to actually help, for example, saving you money if you have solar and you store it in a neighborhood battery and then use it later. That's probably coming in several years, but there's certainly pilot projects around to use that. And that's a really good way of actually making better use of renewable energy, because certainly in South Australia, there are times when South Australia generates more renewable energy than it can even use. And in those times, that sort of gets wasted unless it can be stored in a battery. So when these neighborhood batteries come along, they're actually really going to help to get better value from all that renewable energy that's been generated, not just by big generators, but by solar panels on your roof or on your local community building or something. The other one is community energy projects, or sometimes called solar gardens, where there's like a small sort of neighborhood-based solar or wind generator, and there's like an arrangement with people who, like, maybe they're members of it, they own a share, or maybe they just have a limited service they sell to local people at a cheaper price. And you might not have solar on your roof, but you can buy off this solar garden and it's cheaper than buying it from the grid. This is a great idea. Again, it hasn't really happened. You might hear about it and it sounds like a great idea, but it's actually complicated to make it work in the current system that we have, because the energy system, the way the system works, the rules and the regulations, they're really still largely based on the old world sort of system where, massive power stations sending power to little houses at the end of it. The whole network is changing. There's solar and wind everywhere now through the grid. These community energy projects, community energy generators really could make a difference and be a place where people can buy locally generated renewable energy cheaper, and they're saving money and they're reducing emissions. But again, we need regulatory change to make this work properly. There's been some modeling done. It's just like it's so expensive to do it because of the way charging works for conveying their energy across the wires and that sort of stuff. So again, it's totally going to happen because this stuff is going to be the future of the energy system, but the change is still sort of happening and it's still being figured out how to make it work. So if you're keen on this stuff, keep your ear to the ground. There are pilot projects happening. Local councils and community energy groups are your best sort of point of contact for this stuff, because councils, as we know from this session, councils have sort of sustainability teams that are interested in this stuff and that are trying to make sure that be involved in pilot studies and make sure people know about it. So do recommend that you just keep an ear out for that stuff if you're interested. I think there's going to be a lot of stuff in the community around batteries and local generation, energy sharing, you name it. In the next 5 to 10 years, it's really going to take off, I'm pretty sure. So then we'll all be able to more easily sort of participate in the change that's happening. In the meantime, GreenPower is a good way, if you can afford it, to basically make more renewable energy happen in the grid and to basically know and be confident that your electricity usage is not only not making emissions, but is actually contributing to more renewable energy in the grid for everyone to use. So that's the end of our presentation. Thank you very much. For more information about stuff that Renew does, look at the website or join as a member. We always love to have members because they help keep the organization going. So yes, that's the thing. And now let's do the Q&A.
Thanks, Dean. Really appreciate your presentation there. Some great food for thought there, and we've had a number of questions that have come in from our participants. So Claire had a question about how you know whether a carbon offset is legitimate.
That is difficult because it's hard for us to know. I would be basically trying to find, that's a tough question. I know that when Renew has involving carbon offsets, we used a broker who understood the market and who only used ones that he'd checked out. So I don't know how he did that. I think really the only way is to find a vendor that you trust. I mean, one thing is, a lot of, if you're buying carbon offsets, things like, petrol or flying or something, often you can buy it through, the airline or whatever, but you don't have to. You could also buy it through an independent or a whole separate sort of carbon offset company If you can find a carbon offset company that has good, that is basically recognised as being the genuine one, then that could be an option. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question better. I'm not an expert on carbon offsets. Like I said, when we did these at Renew, we basically outsourced this assessment to an expert because it's pretty complicated. Yeah, that's all the best I can answer that question. I'm sorry. So there might be one we need to find out more information.
My understanding is that there's some discussion about some accreditation schemes that may well be coming online or may well already be in place to give people a bit of confidence so that they're audited and sort of there are commercial and legal instruments in place to make sure that, if you're planting trees, for example, then they're not just sort of, removed the year after or something.
Yeah, and this has been the focus of a lot of this stuff that's been happening in the last couple of years around the whole question of their authenticity. So yeah, I actually think the fact that it all came out about how some of them were dodgy was almost probably the best thing that happened, because it's basically forced the issue to, we need to improve the accreditation system. Yeah.
Okay, great. So if there is increasingly more green power in the market because we're all doing our bit, when do we expect power prices to start to come down? It seems like this is an investment scheme that invests in the environment but doesn't necessarily save the consumer any cash.
That is one of the things with green power, because you pay extra to buy green power, and we all know that power prices have gone up significantly in the last year or so, and we hear that renewable energy is cheaper, and we know that there's more and more of it each year. So the question as to why isn't power getting cheaper is a good one. And the real answer is that, we're in the middle of this transition, and basically over the last decade, we didn't really have good government policy to help smooth out the transition and to guide the transition from fossil fuel to renewable energy, which destroyed a lot of certainty for renewable energy generators and caused a lot of price volatility, prices going up and down all the time, because the electricity market, the price changes every five minutes. It's a nutso system. The prices that you pay are sort of averages, and the more volatility in the prices, basically the higher that average price ends up being. So I think the contribution that green power makes to this is that it provides a bit more certainty for renewable energy generators, and I don't think the effect is immediate, but it's one factor in removing a bit of that price volatility and leading to a curve down in prices in the future. So it doesn't change prices, it doesn't have that immediate effect. And that's all about how complicated the market is. And now that we're moving towards having a bit more consistent policy federally, and now that more of the energy companies are getting more serious about the transition because they are also harmed by the volatile prices, I think that things are going to stabilize over the next few years, but that's a bit of a guess, and I think it's just a longer term thing.
Okay, great. So several communities around Australia, including Mitcham here in South Australia, are developing local energy supply systems with solar and local storage. Mitcham has a Shine Hub program that it's been developing. How does a renter fare in those areas, and how does that compare to others buying green power?
So is that question about sort of renewable systems, say in apartment blocks? And is that
not necessarily? So the Mitcham Shine Hub system is a subscription system whereby residents can either have a solar system and or a battery system installed, or just use their existing system and subscribe to Shine Hub as a kind of a virtual power plant kind of approach.
Yeah, okay. Well, yeah, no, those things are difficult for renters if they involve that you need to have that equipment in your house. That's always been one of the limitations for renters. Some people who rent in social or public housing, there's been some renewable energy projects in social and public housing in South Australia and in Victoria and a couple of other places where they're doing solar and battery. So that's one thing. But yeah, one of the problems with this energy transition is that people who don't own their house have much fewer options for that stuff. And that's why I think, green power is one thing that you can do, but it doesn't actually save you money. And those other things, neighborhood batteries, community energy, like solar farms, down the track, I think they will be part of the solution, but we're sort of not quite that. So it's a challenging for renters. I'm a renter, and it frustrates me that, I can't do that. That I can't, get rid of my gas heating, and that I can't, save money by installing solar and having, it's pretty good payback on solar systems these days. So it is difficult for renters. And I think that we're seeing a bit of a shift in general policy, not just in energy, around tenure in housing about renters. Because, renters, there's about 30% of Australians rent their homes. And increasingly younger people are locked out of buying homes, and that's changing. I think that's changing the way that, the population at large thinks about owning and renting. And I think we're seeing a few places where the balance is shifting to support renters a bit more. And I really hope that this will be one of them. In Victoria, the government has a solar for renters program where landlords can get a discount on installing solar, and they're really trying to sort of push it towards renters. It hasn't had very much take up. I think it's difficult to do that, but I think increasingly people in policy are realizing renters are locked out from lots of things. They're locked into higher energy prices. They're increasingly locked into higher housing costs in the longer term, and poor quality housing. And there's a lot of stuff happening. So I hope that this is part of it.
One of the concerns that has been raised a lot in the discussion about increasing renewables is baseload power and the reliability of the grid. If we have so much capacity being provided by GreenPower, that is solar's only available when the sun shines, and wind power only when the wind's blowing. Do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, it's sort of complicated. One good thing to note is that baseload is not generation, it's consumption. Load means energy that you use. That's where the term comes from. Base loads were energy usage designed to happen during times of low energy use, otherwise low energy usage, in order to keep the power stations running. There's less need for that when we have less sort of big coal power stations, for example. And when you don't have any coal power stations in South Australia anymore, there's always going to be need for electricity when, yes, as they say, the sun's not shining and the wind's not blowing. And that's why this is a transition. We can't sort of switch to all renewable overnight. There's going to be a role for, I think there's going to be a role for those old coal power stations for a bit longer. There's going to be a role for gas power stations for a bit longer still, I think, as the prices of other technologies come down. And there's new and old renewable technologies that are becoming more common. One is hydro, and we know there's some very old hydro power stations in Australia, particularly in Tasmania. They run all the time. There is a lot of talk and some pre-development of newer, smaller ones that basically work like what they call pumped hydro, where they buy excess solar or wind when it's not needed, and they buy it cheaply because it's not needed. So the generators sell as cheap as they can, and then they use that to pump water up a hill. And then when there's no sun and there's no wind, they run the water down the hill through the turbine to provide power. It's like a type of battery. So they're becoming more common. Batteries, like you've got I said the big one at Hornsdale, and the price of batteries is coming down. It's sort of taking its time coming down, but it is coming down. They will end up being a big part of it. And there's also solar thermal. There was a big solar thermal project that was going to be in South Australia that didn't go ahead a couple of years ago. And that was really the main, it's a bit of a complicated story why it didn't go ahead, but part of it was, this uncertainty in the transition. So I think we'll see solar thermal. Solar thermal is completely different to regular solar. It uses mirrors that reflect the sun up to a big tower, and it heats up molten salt, and it stores enormous amounts of heat. And then you use that to run a turbine, just like you would with burning coal, except it's just from the steam from this sort of really hot salt that you've heated up with the sun. And that's like a solar power station with a built-in battery. And, they're expensive, but they're no more expensive than, once the technology is settled, they're really no more expensive than, say, a big coal power station. So there's a lot happening. And one of the things that's going to be different is that when we have a system that's more based on renewables, that's mostly or completely based on renewables, it's going to be a variable system where there's different generation at different times all the time. There's storage, and there'll be lots more storage around the community. It's not just centralized. Think about people with home batteries, neighborhood batteries, home solar systems. There's so much energy everywhere. It's just a different type of system to a whole lot of centralized power sending it to one or two places. And there's a whole lot of stuff in our system that is designed to use electricity overnight in order to allow coal power stations to keep running. And we still have them in South Australia with lots of off-peak overnight hot water systems. Why are they overnight? So that the old coal power stations that no longer exist could keep running and didn't have to stop. The South Australia Power Networks is starting a program to switch them to come on during the day instead of during the night, because now that's when we need extra load, because we have too much solar in the middle of the day, especially in South Australia, but increasingly everywhere. So it's actually the matter, it ends up being about balancing generation and usage according to the time that it is. And one thing that Renew did in the last couple of years was this big forward-looking study about what's a 100% renewable grid going to look like by 2035 or by 2050. And the answer was pretty much heaps of generation of all different types, lots of load shifting where possible in terms of, pool pumps and hot water systems, and, even some industrial plant that ends up being able to work more efficiently at different times. There's going to be lots of changes in how we use energy, and it's all going to be, in the end designed to make most use of what we can. So it's a big change, and it's a lot of little pieces of that change.
So just on that that issue, going back a second, Michael's asked a question around explaining the different shoulder rates and how this translates into the prices that we pay with the change from daytime generation from coal power generation at night.
Okay, is that about the shoulder rates on the tariffs, on the new tariffs, perhaps? Yeah, with the...
I think so.
Time of use tariffs. Yeah, that does make it a bit harder for you to calculate what your bill might be based on your usage, because it happens at different times of day. But the whole purpose of those tariffs is to basically reflect the need for energy at different times of day. Like the new tariff that SA Power Networks is doing is like a really, really cheap rate in the middle of the day, because there's lots of solar energy. There's often more than can be used. So that's to encourage usage. And for some people, that might be doing things in the middle of the day if they can, but it's mostly going to be automated equipment that comes on in the middle of the day. There's a lot of industrial processes that need to happen, and it doesn't matter when they happen. They just happen at whatever's a good time for them to happen, and they could happen during the day. Like I said, we could do the hot water systems during the day. So that's what they call the solar soak rate. And the shoulder rate is like the in-between rate, which is the morning peak and the afternoon peak, where it costs more. And the idea of that is that will discourage usage at that time of day. And again, it's going to end up being not so much encouraging people to use things at different times, but appliances, newer appliances will be the standards are already there for appliances like air conditioners and washing machines and that, so that they can basically get signals as to when's a good time to go on. So for a whole lot of stuff where it doesn't matter when it goes on, it can go on at a time that suits us best. And when we really need to use it at a certain time, we can override it. It's going to be the same for charging your car. You might not need to charge your car at the same time every day. You just need to make sure it's got enough battery when you use it. So car chargers, when they're electric cars, will probably also get these signals so that they know how much to always keep in the battery as a minimum. And they also will charge when the electricity is cheaper and less when it's more expensive. And what that means for your house is that you'll have this tariff where it's got cheap parts and expensive parts. And sometimes you can't avoid using electricity in the expensive parts. If you're cooking dinner or giving the kids a bath at 6 o'clock, you're going to be using the more expensive electricity. But a whole lot of your usage will be happening in the cheaper part of the day, and it sort of balances out. And we've done some analysis on time of use tariffs. And for most households, it ends up costing less overall, even though some times of day it costs more. And that's because increasingly we have a lot of usage that happens all through the day, and that ends up taking advantage of the cheap rates.
Margaret has asked if you're aware of a book called The Big Switch by Saul Griffiths, and if you have any reflections on that.
I am aware of it. I haven't read it, so I don't have reflections on it specifically. That's all about this big transition that we're doing, and Saul Griffiths has got a big, a lot of experience and knowledge about renewable energy and the transition. And yeah, as far as I know, because like I said, I haven't read the book, it's all about some of these bigger picture stuff of how society is changing, how the energy system is changing. And yeah, look, I've had it recommended to me. I haven't read it, so I would feel weird recommending it to others, but by all accounts, it's a really good read if you want to understand some of this stuff that we've been talking about in a bit more detail. So I will take the weird step of recommending a book that I haven't read. I'm also recommending it to myself because it's on my list. But yeah, and that's an example. There's so much sort of scholarship and, thought and writing now about this is a big challenge of our time. We've had these challenges before, the electrification of our society in the first place, going back to the early part of the 20th century, was a huge change. The advent of the motor vehicle was a huge change. It upset some people, it put some people out of work, it made new jobs for other people. Some people managed to transition from the old system to the new system. Blacksmiths became mechanics or radiator repair people. These are the sort of changes that societies have when big changes happen. And this is just another one of those.
Margaret reassures us that it's a great read.
Fantastic.
So just going back to the shoulder rates, does that tie in with the futures market for electricity?
If you're talking about the shoulder rates on the tariff, not specifically, but the futures market for electricity is interesting. I didn't go into so much detail when I explained about the electricity market and how retailers buy power, but basically energy retailers buy forward contracts. I mean, the energy market is mostly a financial market. They buy forward contracts. They make contracts with generators for the next 12 months. I'll buy this much electricity at this price. And that bypasses the regular electricity market. They just have a contract with that generator to use electricity. When they're in the market on the day, because electricity is sold in 5-minute blocks for the next 5 minutes, and it gets settled every half hour. It's a crazy system. When they're in that, the retailer, they've got all these customers. They know how much their customers use in that 5-minute period. We have to buy this much. All right, our contracts for the futures only covers this much. We need to buy a bit extra. They buy the last bit from the wholesale market. This is why that price variability causes higher prices, because when prices are more stable, it's much more predictable for electricity retailers how much they'll have to end up spending on that extra amount. And when the price is volatile, they don't. So yeah, look, I mean, the futures market is in some ways, it's related to GreenPower in that generators deal more with that futures market than with the everyday. So when a GreenPower accredited generator is making their investment decisions, they're sort of going, I can rely on this much renewable energy certificate from the renewable energy target. I can probably rely on this much from GreenPower. That gives me a guide as to what I can invest. And then all those retailers, they also know that they have to comply with the renewable energy target and with the GreenPower, whatever GreenPower they have. So when they're doing their purchasing, their futures purchasing, we can offer that because they both have confidence that they can offer that futures contract because they know that whatever happens, that electricity will be dispatched and will be used, because that's what the certificates mean. It means that that electricity absolutely will be dispatched from that power station. Because basically what happens in the market, very summary of how the market works, all these generators, they bid into the market every 5 minutes. They go, I'll sell 20, I'll sell 50 at this price, I'll sell 30 at this price. And then the market basically dispatches them from the cheapest to the most expensive. So once they've dispatched all the electricity that was used, all the others, they can't sell their electricity. They can't sell anything. So they just don't, that electricity gets wasted. It's crazy, but this is how the market works. And this is why, these certificates, they mean that the electricity has to get dispatched. And it doesn't happen in real time, because the real-time market happens just on what's happening right now, but it means that it happens through the forward contracts, and that's the futures market. So GreenPower is basically active in the futures market.
There was a question about when we have quite a lot of wind turbines here in South Australia, and if you drive around past them, you'll notice at any one time quite a lot of them aren't moving. Is this because the owners of those turbines are sort of turning them off to until they can get a better margin for the electricity?
In some ways, basically, like I just said about the market, if they can't sell as much as what they can produce, then there's no point producing it. Typically, if it's a mild sunny day when all that rooftop solar is going off, then wind turbines basically will be able to sell a bit less wind, because so much, and so will gas power stations, so will any power stations. So that's where, you know, if there's just not enough demand to take that wind farm's output, they'll just turn off some to bring their output down to match the demand. And that's actually what makes wind cheaper in the market. What makes wind and solar cheaper in the market than gas and coal, because it's much easier and costs barely anything for a wind farm or for a solar farm to just go, we're going to cut back our output and we're just going to sell what can be used. It's much harder, especially for a coal power station, to do that, because they're just running all the time and it's much harder to turn up and down. And the gas ones, it's, you know, it's tricky to, you know, it's more costly to turn the gas stuff on and off, just because of the process, the technical process involved. So that's one reason why renewables are cheaper. They're not spending money on fuel to generate the electricity, and it's simple for them to turn them off and on. But that is what's happening. I know there's been some, you might have heard some stuff about energy generators artificially driving higher prices. That is a thing that's happened. It's actually mostly happened with gas generators, because they're sort of in between. They're more flexible than coal, but they're more expensive to run than wind and solar. So there was a bit of a thing a few years ago where it was believed, but it was hard. I think, I'm not sure how the compliance worked, but where it seemed that some gas generators were not bidding in the market and then bidding at the last minute to try to drive the price higher. And that was about profiteering. But yeah, with the wind turbines, they could potentially do that, but I think it's generally much more like that. They're just adjusting their output to meet the demand. Because there's certainly at times, especially in South Australia, when rooftop solar powers everything, like on a hot mild day, on a really hot day. Yeah, absolutely. And rooftop solar always is dispatched first because it's in the system. You know, there's actually the unfortunate reality for people with solar is that sometimes rooftop solar means that less large-scale renewable solar gets dispatched because it's taken its place. And, you know, that's not affecting the total amount of renewable energy at that time, because all the rooftop solar is going and that's renewable. But it is an issue that sort of affects the wind and solar a little bit more than the gas and coal, who are already used to, you know, being more active in the times when solar generation is lower.
Great. Okay. And one last question from Michael. Is GreenPower dependent on infrastructure, load management, and power flow? And if so, what investment is being made in those spaces?
I'm not quite sure I follow all that question. Sorry, Michael.
Not sure I do either. Sorry.
It's not instantaneous. It's mainly, like we were saying before, it mainly works in the forward contracts market, which is like the futures market. So it doesn't happen instantly. Like when I'm using, if I've got 100% green power and I turn on my clothes dryer or something, and there's not that much solar, then, you know, I use whatever electricity is available at the time. Even if I've got 100% renewable, even if I've got 100% green power, that might mean I'm using, you know, a gas power station at that time. Though you can't really trace the electrons from the power station to the house, really. But, you know, there's times when there's not much renewable generation and a lot of people are using gas or coal, even if they've got green power. So that the green power doesn't mean that they're never using it. What it means is that whatever they used gets invested in forward contracts with renewable generators to increase their capacity or to increase the amount they're able to dispatch. So it does actually cycle through the system, but it actually takes time. Like I think I mentioned the green power certificates and the other renewable energy certificates, they've got a year to use them. So if I use, you know, 50 kilowatt hours of green power and my retailer's got these, you know, got to buy this, has got these 50 kilowatt hours of renewable energy certificates that they have to use to buy, or they have to buy from a basically they've got the obligation, they've got to buy it from a green power accredited generator, then they've got a year to buy that. So it might not happen straight away, but it does happen in the end. And again, because of the way
Sorry,
So-
Stefan. I think we might have lost it. Oh, we've got him back. My
Yep,
apologies.
froze for a second.
Dean, you just froze for a second there.
Yeah.
Maybe reverse about 10 seconds.
Yep. Where was I? Yeah, just I said that where was I? 10 seconds. It's a forward contracts. So they've got a year to get to redeem the certificates. So it doesn't mean that it's using the green power right at that time, but it means that within a year that has to be accounted for in a forward contract from a accredited green power generator. It has to mean more green power in the system because it has to replace fossil fuel, because it's a zero-sum system. You can't just add extra electricity to the system. So it does actually mean that more renewable energy is coming into the system and that less fossil fuel is. It just happens over the cycle of the contract. And because one of the conditions of the certificate is that the power has to be dispatched. So that's basically how it works. So look, it's actually a complex sort of economical and financial sort of market, and I'm not an economist or finance specialist, so I'm only able to explain any sort of principles rather than a lot of detail. But it balances over time, and it does lead to the growth. And the most important part of it is that it creates certainty for investment decisions of new renewable generators. And that's the biggest thing, because when you're trying to get investors to invest in your new wind farm or solar farm, it's all about the numbers. It's all about, can you sell what you produce? Will investors get their money back? Is there a market for what you're selling? And every single green power certificate adds to the market. Like the metaphor I used before, which is a bit clunky, but I sort of think it works. If everybody had to buy an ice cream in winter, the ice cream shop would know it could open in winter because they know that people had to buy the ice cream. Of course, it would be silly if people were required to buy ice cream, but that's sort of how green power works. They have to buy it, whether they like it or not, they just have to.
All right. Well, look, thank you very much, Dean. Really appreciate you sharing your wisdom with us this evening. I'd like to thank everyone who gave up their weeknight to perhaps eat their dinner in front of the computer for a bit of a change. These sessions, the Renew series, have been brought to you by the regional climate partnerships, which are partnerships between local governments, the state government, and other regional partners, and they are delivered to the community free of charge. So please share them with your friends and your family and anyone else who you think might be able to benefit from them. Our next seminar is an all-electric homes seminar on the 25th of July, aligning with the kind of electrify everything principle. So please tune in for that or forward that on to anyone that you think might be interested. Following your attendance tonight, you'll receive a follow-up email and survey to fill out. Please do that straight away if you can, while it's fresh in your mind and you're able to remember everything. It's right at the front of your mind. And please also keep an eye out for other events happening around Adelaide in the next few weeks. There are lots of NAIDOC week events, including movie screenings, family events, basket weaving, and more. And to find out more about those, you can visit your council website or the NAIDOC week calendar of events. Thank you all for coming. Please fill out those surveys. Really appreciate the opportunity to deliver this to you tonight. Have a great evening.